I want to welcome you to the Regenerative Insight Circle. We're in presentation mode today with Tim Gieseke. The Regenerative Insight Circle meets regularly on Wednesday mornings, Thursday evening, European time. We also have emergent discussions on all things regenerative. So join us if you can. This is being held in the context of the Global Regeneration Collab. I've been hosting these meetings for the last couple of years. My name is Andrew Crosby, and I'm founder of Third Horizon Earth. It's a practice accelerator that will launch later this year. Tim and I have been talking for a long time now, a year or so anyway, and I'm really happy that he's here. Today, Tim is going to present his work, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss it so you get the flavor of how we do things here. We're into appreciative inquiry, so it's not a debate. What we're trying to do as a group is understand what Tim's talking about, add to it, connect to it in whatever way we can. So that's kind of how it goes. We'll try and make short interventions if we can, and hopefully we'll have time for everyone to either add your own comments or a question. It is a circle in that sense. That's all I'm going to say for now. I'm really happy to have you with us, Tim, so go for it.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate being able to be here, and it's always like sharing, one's work. You get such good perspective on it, and I always learn something about it as I go. So this will be very good, and then we'll see what kind of insights are come up. I'm sitting now on our family farm, been in the family for 140 years in the Midwest, in the United States, in Minnesota. And I haven't lived here my whole life, but I returned to it about 20 years ago. And our sons are the 5th generation on the farm, and I've been farming since 1996 on a part-time basis as I work through my career and developing eco-commerce. And so I'll share that journey a little bit and then explain how I see how we can fork to the next economy, which is kind of a thing that just popped up, I think, talking to Andrew 6-8 weeks ago. So, and it's kind of, a play on words with blockchain as well as these technologies come forward. So I'll walk through these slides. Andrew will probably watch the chat if there's a hand need to be raised, or else, can stop me if you have a clarifying question. There's 10 slides and there's some depth to each one, I believe. This is a diagram from my second book, and based on people's thinking. And I used it to talk about forking the economy. So I kind of looked at it. Economic systems have forked throughout human history. And this forking definition in blockchain is to add a protocol that initiates a new pathway of interaction for creating new information and value. There's soft forks. That means you add a protocol that is compatible with the previous, or a hard fork, which basically separates the two and is not compatible with the past. I see these economic forks as soft forks, meaning everything's compatible. We add a new protocol. And so on the diagram above, ecological systems, humankind relied on them basically firsthand. It was abundance, kind of the Garden of Eden perspective where everything was there. Agriculture and commerce and globalization, entered the picture over centuries, and we began to understand these business ecosystems, which have been around for a while, but really only recognized in the latter part of the 20th century. So a lot of time passed really between the first and second forking. As we entered the digitized internet and platform world, we saw the e-commerce ecosystem. So when we forked again, brought new values and new protocol, and everything in the past remains compatible. And then in the turn of the century, and when I began my work in eco-commerce, I saw big data, GIS, Internet of Things, cryptocurrencies. I see the next forking is eco-commerce. So in some ways, we're making full circle back to the ecological systems, but with additional protocols added. So, this is such an interesting time to be alive, of course, on this planet, and you can see how things accelerate over the millennia, and as we incorporate new value. So here's a picture of a part of our family farm. We have managed natural capital and profited from ecosystem services in these changing economic systems. like I say, our sons of the fifth generation. And the land management strategies are influenced by natural capital capacity, market signals, and farm policies. And if we were standing on this hill for the last 140 years and take a picture every year, you would see changes over many aspects of it, how it was drained, how it was farmed, how it was tilled, all sorts of aspects. Basically the same natural capital, its capacities change due to our interaction with it. And then ecosystem services, the broad sense, the broad definition of that term includes provisional, which is the food and fiber that we produce, and then also the regulating ecosystem services, the water quality and carbon sequestration. So kind of that next fork for our farm operation and all others is how do we bring those other ecosystem services onto my management dashboard where market signals can guide me, because I do understand what the world and society wants from our farm, but the market signals are not coherent. They're not aligned with how we've been managing our farm. And, for that to occur, we need to be, find some more clarity in that. So this was taken just a few days ago. We have been in a semi-drought this year, but we have a rotational grazing system here, regenerative grazing, incorporated agroforestry in it over the last 20 years. So, it's a very nice operation that we've converted from really row crop in the mid-90s to this regenerative rotational grazing system today. So beyond that practical experience, I've written 3 books in the decade of 2009 and 2019. The first was Eco-Commerce 101. I did not know I was going to write a book besides 3, but my business attorney told me about 2007 or 8 that, Tim, I think you figured something out here. You should put it in writing. It doesn't have to be long, 80 pages, 100 pages. Well, it took me 380 pages to what I thought I had to do was tie the loose ends from an economic and ecological perspective, and went through that process fairly rapidly. And the subtitle of that book is Adding an Ecological Dimension to the Economy. So that's the piece I saw as missing. As I applied these land management metrics and did several projects related to the eco-commerce model, I recognized that this is a commons and we need to look at shared governance. What part of governance isn't working for these pieces? I'd sit around a table with multiple sectors and I could see the conflict, not in goals, but in governance. And so I pursued that and wrote this book. And in this book also introduced the natural capital unit, which is an accounting unit, but it also means for shared governance. It's a plaintiff service where accountability, partnerships, equity, and ownership come together. That's really a shared governance model. And then as I delved deeper into governance, collaborative governance frameworks in the book, that I kind of just went a little deeper into understanding these collaborative frameworks and created a model to assess network governance to provide some sense making for that. So this presentation focuses a lot on the second book, really the how-to book of the 3 books. The first is really how the policy and the natural capital is the nexus, and then the last book is really how these collaborative networks work. So kind of the thesis of this is a natural capital accounting system that appeases both economic and ecological accounting requirements can advance ecosystem service markets. And the technological architecture is now available, and it's really a gridded landscape with these NCU natural capital units. And that has the means to unbundle and rebundle ecosystem services value at the scope and scale desired by market participants. When I wrote Eco-Commerce in 2010, I thought, this opportunity was around the corner. But as time went on, I realized the technological need to scale it. I applied Eco-Commerce in 2010, 11, more rudimentary spreadsheets and things like that. But to scale it required technologies like multi-sided platforms and now even like blockchain and things like that. So that only emerged in the last few years, and some of these pieces are coming together. So blockchain, generally, if you can come with an irreducible unit of value that can be unbundled and rebundled, that's kind of their language. And so That's kind of the trick of a lot of these markets.
So quick question.
Yes.
So if just reading between the lines or reading the lines themselves, it's basically like breaking it down to a commodification of the most basic unit, which is tradable, which can then be built up to something which can be basically fit into financial framework, which can actually leverage the ability for global markets to understand what the underlying value is for the value proposition, which currently is not understood.
Yeah, and I'll get into a little deeper of that. And yeah, and so the commodification is not so much of the ecosystem service itself, but a commodification of the data that represents it. Because as a fifth generation or a fourth generation farmer, I'm not about to auction off my ecosystem services or my natural capital. So yeah, and that's a concern. And so I look at this as we're trying to create an accounting framework, not a valuation framework. So it doesn't have to be a monetary value. It can be any kind of appreciative value, but at the same time, there needs to be an accounting system. Of course, anything you apply has biases, but really want to be an agnostic accounting system, and how that is valued is not up to me.
Putting boxes around common units.
Yes. So hopefully some of that works through. So natural capital is the foundation of the economy and ecology. I mean, that's a statement that one would have to agree with to agree with this approach. The comment or the quote, the ecology is not a subset of the economy, it's the other way around, is how I embrace this. So if we look at a natural capital unit, so basically a rectangular prism on the landscape, with that, I developed a natural capital classification system that I feel was lacking relative to appeasing both economy and ecological values. So if I dissect this natural capital unit into natural capital, I see there's a abiotic layer, renewable inflowing energy and resources. The ecosystems we get from that are solar, wind, geothermal, and those are provisional, cultural, and supporting ecosystem services. Another layer is a biotic layer, conditionally renewable biophysical resources. So that would be the flora and fauna. It's conditionally renewable because it's conditioned on how it's managed, and it's a substance, a bushel of corn, a timber, it's a biophysical resource. Again, provisional, cultural, and supporting ecosystem services come from that. The third category is biotic, a conditionally renewable bioprocess. These are the carbon sequestration, water cleansing, pollination, and soil health, regulating cultural and supporting ecosystem services. And then the last category is abiotic, non-renewable geophysical resources, minerals, gravels, subsoils, hydrocarbons, and again, provisional, cultural, and supporting. So this is kind of a dissecting of a natural capital unit. And this is really how I manage our landscape as a agricultural producer. I understand each one of these categories and utilize them to the greatest extent. The economy does not see this. Conditionally renewable bioprocesses are currently invisible to the economy. I mean, there's lots of markets that are trying to make them visible, but relative to the economic system, they're not visible. So, and you can kind of see the trend there. The three provisional ones we are able to account for. We use them, we have created accounting systems for it. The regulating ecosystem category, it's less tangible, and therefore we've been able to overlook them. Not everyone overlooks them, but the economic system as a whole has. So the NCUs can become the basis for ecological and economic accounting. So to make intangible ecosystems visible, we need a modern bushel basket. New intangible values need new accounting units. And I intuitively knew I needed an accounting unit, and I had shared a paper that kind of, sometimes you need confirmation of why you did something. And it's any kind of new intangible unit, you have to kind of make up your own accounting unit because they don't exist. And that's one reason why they're intangible. So, 500 years ago, the bushel basket was invented as a production accounting unit for provisional ecosystem services. NCUs we see as the new bushel basket for regulating ecosystem services. So what is the container to put these new values in? And when that bushel basket was proposed, I assume people thought, why do I need that? The day before we were, exchanging and doing things, but what it did is, really change the capacity to account for and trade and things like that. So that's kind of where we're at with ecosystem services. We don't really have a bushel basket. Things are traded all sorts of ways. A bushel basket isn't equivalent across the board. Corn is 56 bushels per bushel basket. Oats are 32. So it doesn't have to be identical. It just needs to be an accounting unit that provides some coherence. So we'll kind of go through this process again. So we have a gridded landscape. Digitally, we can do all sorts of things to it. We can use it as a matchmaker tool or all sorts of things digitally. So we have this NCU. We're able to, create a stack based on those natural capital classifications. We can rebundle my stack on my farm. The value I get from that is going to be different than others. Right now, we have very limited stacks we use. A lot of times it's just the one is corn, right? That's the only really ecosystem we count for. There could be carbon and water quality and biodiversity and all sorts of things. So this kind of helps us expand that stack in a coherent way. It enables horizontal and vertical accounting. So what does that mean is each layer, let's say that extended layer out is carbon. And so one market can be an overlay, and you can account for eco markets across a layer. And then natural capital accountability is really the vertical. So if I go out and do a practice on my landscape, I inherently change every one of those layers. I mean, not necessarily, but most likely. So there can be outputs of carbon and water quality and cropping. And if I plow the land, I generally will have all those change somewhat. So part of this reason is important is because sometimes we get credits for one thing and we cause greater harm in another. And those they're not interdependently accounted for. So, that's critical. Or in another vein, if I just focus of corn production and I raise that, value, but I, at the same time, I'm decreasing the value of carbon and water quality, other things. How does that show up in a total sum? So this helps that keep it coherent. So, in this model, single or multiple ecosystem services are accounted for within these NCU bushel baskets, and maybe I'll get a different term for that, but creating an interoperable marketplace that eliminates double counting on that horizontal accounting system. And greenwashing, basically, because if you can site specifically identify something that occurred, any kind of claim should be able to be accounted for back to this natural capital grid. And then you can do it at any scale. And what's important there is I can draw a polygon on the map for carbon sequestration. I can draw another polygon on the map for biodiversity, and another polygon for my field. And they may not all line up, but the NCU can track that. And over the last 3 years, I've talked to blockchain developers and others on here. And this isn't something that's easy to do, but it's not impossible to do. A lot of the technologies actually are in place, and from a year ago, costs and ability to do these things is greatly costs have decreased and ability has increased. So overall, it's not very complicated to understand this concept. The complexity is built in, and so it's really do we have functioning markets for these ecosystem services? Well, we do for wind and solar and geothermal. We can account for them and we market them and we value them. With flora and fauna, the crops, these biophysical resources we can touch and feel and sell. We don't have a functioning market for the conditionally removed bioprocesses. We're working on that. And then the abiotic, yes, there's functioning markets for that. So the no might be a little strong, but it's not really it's not a functioning market. I'll definitely say that. So when we go back to forking the economy, adding an NCU protocol that integrates natural capital with landscape management and eco. So it's simply just adding that ecological dimension to the economy. So, I mean, that's a very rudimentary way to put it, but maybe in the next couple of slides we'll maybe get a more practical example. So here's the context and logic of NCU-based eco market. And this is kind of a back of the napkin deal, so others may refine numbers. But if we look at, and this is, consider this the numbers with an asterisk, but this is some, preliminary research I did to kind of put some numbers on the screen. So I think they're in the right magnitude. So if there's 800 billion tons of CO2 to create 410 parts per million in our atmosphere, and we want to reduce that 120 billion tons or 240 trillion pounds of carbon dioxide, how do we use this to make sense of that market? So there's 110 trillion terrestrial NCUs. So with that math, 2.18 pounds of CO2 per NCU would be needed to make that reduction, which comes to about 5 tons of CO2 per acre. Here's the logic that's presented in here. If there's 800 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere to create 410 parts per million, and these are numbers that I haven't researched deeply, but I thought they were reliable sources. Just wanted to put this together. So on our model, there's 110 trillion terrestrial NCUs, and those are relatively productive ones. I mean, we're not talking mountaintops, everything. And then, so if you do that math, 2.18 pounds of carbon dioxide per NCU, or about 5 tons per acre. And then, because it's hard to put 5 tons of carbon dioxide in an acre, but if you look at it over a decade period, it's about a half a ton, which a lot of the carbon markets strive for a half a ton of CO2 per acre per year per decade. So, so part of it is what I saw lacking is, these supply and demand dynamics for all of these ecosystem services. And as I present this to some agriculture groups, well, here you'd have that one ecosystem service stack out there, and you could identify the CO2. But if you can see the highlighted squares down there, you can imagine if you'd overlay this grid on the planet, and I have regenerative agriculture systems in place, so I'm sequestering carbon to the best of my capacity. And and then in an urban area, there's a parking lot, paid parking lot, that it's going to have no ability to sequester carbon. And then perhaps you under one of these NCUs is a smokestack, so what's the emission and what's the sequestration that's occurring on an NCU basis, and how does that inform us of where carbon is coming from and where it can go? And I've never appreciated the permanence of carbon sequestration as a only solution, because on our farm we don't permanently sequester carbon. I mean, some of it might be, but we have a living system here. What I see is if we can account for carbon as a flux, we need to sequester more carbon than we emit on a yearly basis to draw it down. And permanent storage of carbon is, like I say, is part of the solution. But biologically speaking, I think we'll be ahead of the game if we look at a flux and how a market incentive toward an operation like ours or my neighbors, that we can account for value, and then and what's the overall goal, and then how do we reduce this atmospheric concentration in a way that fits more like a market. And so that's the overview. It's proposing an accounting system. I feel what we've been trying to do is solve half the problem. We're providing half of the solution. We're providing transaction models, but we're not providing the accounting system model. And I believe I've read there were 17,000 voluntary carbon markets. I assume we're making progress on that, but without an accounting system, it's hard to be accountable. And so that's kind of the direction we're going here is, can we provide an agnostic accounting system that has some framework in it that entities can identify where on the globe they want to accomplish goals, and then apply their metrics and their values in a way that meets their needs, because there's no two groups that often decide what metric and what value to put on there. And I think that's fine. What I think this will allow us to do is begin to converge on what metrics make sense. What are the most efficient, because they're going to be the most evolving piece of the puzzle. The metrics of carbon sequestration will be significantly different in a decade. And I think what we focus too much on now is getting that perfect metric when there's, well, of course, it doesn't exist, but at the same time, we need a platform to allow that to evolve as well. And so if we have a stationary accounting, we can, vet through, and the best metric is the cheapest one, the most accurate one, and the most flexible. So it's kind of providing that playing field. So I'll conclude there, and appreciate any discussion on there. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Why don't let's just take a few questions and comments. I imagine there are a few that may have built up over the course of this. So if you can, please raise your virtual hand, and we'll take 4 or 5, and then maybe Tim can come back to us. So go ahead.
So first of all, I really do want to appreciate the work that you've done. It makes a ton of sense to me. And I really think that it is a very clear and lucid way of breaking down and understanding how this can be well conceived and broken down in sort of like a physics approach sort of way, which I think is necessary to approach a problem, which at the end of the day is a scientific problem. Going to the point of valuation of carbon credits, my background is in finance, just done a deep dive in the global carbon market. And the reality of the situation is that the valuation that you have on carbon credits across the globe relates to whether they're voluntary markets or whether they're, cap and trade markets. In the cap and trade markets, you have supply and demand dynamics. And in the voluntary markets, a lot of times you have information disparate imbalances where the providers of these credits are basically not as well informed as the buyers of the credits. And many times, the reason why in some cases you get a premium value for a credit is because you have a higher perceived value of the credit. Now, if we can create a global framework which is based on these NCUs globally, maybe we can arrive at a universal framework for valuing voluntary credits. And I think that this really could be the framework for a unified approach to the valuation of global carbon associated with global carbon projects, which will allow a global market, one market, which can clear in large volume.
Maybe we could get a couple more comments. We've got about 20 minutes left.
Thank you, Tim, for your thought leadership, your very deep thought leadership in this area. My question is a systemic question. As you know, as soon as a new accounting method, a new structure, framework is put in place, the majority of the players gather around the methodology itself rather than on the purpose of it. So do you have a view on potentially what might happen? Should everybody just start moving towards this accounting framework? What gets left out? What changes in the commons and so on?
And let's go to Sid.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to your special group. And I spoke with Tim about, 6 weeks ago, perhaps, and I was really intrigued by this approach. I've been working in carbon markets since the 90s. Sorry, I have COVID, so I'm a little clogged up here. But so I've set up and managed carbon funds. I had a retail carbon business. I did a lot of carbon work for the International Finance Corporation, which does emerging market finance. And my last project there was a carbon-linked bond. But I'm currently developing a fund that's focused in Latin America, and that's to channel carbon finance, conservation finance into enterprises that do the great things that Tim was suggesting farms can do. And one of the areas I'm really interested in is looking at how do we engage smallholder farmers, like little farmers, into more sustainable practices, reducing their emissions, reducing deforestation, sequestering carbon, and so on. And so I think this tool could be really interesting for that, because here, up until now, farmers can't afford to do what the existing carbon markets require in terms of documentation, verification, blah, blah, blah. It's very expensive. And so what we're hoping to do with this fund is to provide aggregation services to small farmers, and they would receive payments through intermediaries like cooperatives and input suppliers and so on. But what I'm wondering is, how do we verify that the farmer has done something, or that the trees, let's say they're planting agroforestry, like commercial species, tree species for land restoration? How, like, is it all automated? Because that's something we would really like to do, which is really not allowed much in current systems. But yeah, question is, how are these things, and can we verify the biodiversity? Is it with eDNA or multiple layers? I'm just curious about that, and how you're moving forward on that as well.
Thank you, Sid.
So the methodology versus purpose. Say we're starting with an agnostic accounting system, and the methodologies of accounting for carbon and biodiversity, these are values that I have learned that entities hold dearly, and they're not subject to standardization at this point, and that has inhibited a lot of this. So I hope I'm answering your question. The purpose is to create a platform for interaction and discovery of how we account for regulating ecosystem values. I see, we need a space for evolution and transparency for how these ecosystem services are accounted for. And to Scott's comments, the geospatial accounting can show which ones are voluntary. They can show which one are metrics on there. They can show the verification schemes on there. And where we envision it, contributors to the platform would propose new metrics. When you get this tokenized ecosystem, if someone uses their metric because it's the most valuable for their constituents, they are part of that. So it's just a new way of looking at it. We're creating that playing field where if there's less certainty, then the value will be less. If there's more certainty, the value will be more. But we need to get people into the process of trading. And so then I'll kind of jump to the smallholder piece. Carbon sequestration does wonders for a person's or for a farm's productivity. There needs to be market values, but it needs to be associated with productivity values too. And some of the people that we're working with look at the carbon markets of $20 an acre as about a fifth of the value they generate by bringing carbon into the soil. So, how can we leverage the contributions, a shared governance approach? How can General Mills, for an example, participate on our farm in a way that benefits their sustainability claims and benefits my productivity, which is also in their best interest? So the NCU emerged out of a shared governance model before it emerged out of an accounting model. And then on the small holders, so I'm a small landowner. I mean, we were farming a larger piece, but now I just have 20 acres of a custom grazing of 20 cows and calves. And, it's a very small holder operation. And I always apply my small holder operation to these models. Well, what we could do is you could have an entity. So here's this matchmaking piece. So if I draw my polygon on the map and I note that I have carbon sequestration and water quality and regenerative agriculture. And so that's a footprint on the map. And let's say General Mills, who is seeking 1 million acres of regenerative agriculture, they draw a circle or a square polygon on the map that covers the upper Midwest. Our two polygons will overlap and we can now connect. They see that we both have common goals, and then they can find me. And one of the biggest costs in these markets is finding people. So the finding is basically free, and then the accounting system becomes almost free, because it's just it's I shouldn't say free, but there's algorithms that manage using your productivity data to put out data that you should probably already have if you're managing your land. And then the verification piece, yes, that is everyone's problem. right? And you can, and it's not, we're not going to solve it on our platform. We will aid in that evolution of it. And we may have attributes on there to make that easier. But really, it comes down to what degree of assurance does an entity want when they buy something. And those can be various degrees, and we can evolve toward a higher, cheaper verification process. But, so that, we want to make sure we identify what we're able to provide, but we're not going to solve values of verification. We'll just create that space. And the aggregation services. So that kind of works with that matchmaking piece. If a corporation or a utility or a cheese processor or a government or whatever entity that has a sustainability claim wants to seek out land management that achieves that sustainability claims, that could occur by this, polygon matchmaking scheme with area of interest and the parameter that's being produced. And that should just shake out in kind of a dating game app if you want to go that route on how to find sustainable outcomes. So.
Okay, great reference, a dating game app. I'll take that one away.
Okay.
Malaya, and then Yangbo, please. Go ahead, Malaya.
Hi, thanks so much, Tim. This is really interesting. I'm wondering if you have addressed this kind of accounting system matched to production data that producers would have in the already.
Should have, could have, yes.
Is that true for each level of these? What my question really is about is, I'm just wondering if you're thinking about how to address, again, we can talk about smallholder farmers, or we can talk about sort of the everyday person who might be interested in doing this kind of accounting, in moving their farm into this kind of system. But in my work on conventional and organic agriculture, there are such cultural barriers to paperwork and new systems of any kind, et cetera. I'm just wondering how you're sort of addressing the more human side of this, innovation that you've come up with.
Go ahead, Yangbo.
Oh, thanks for that intervention and following what Sid and others have noted, that where one of the biggest challenges and trap that so many are falling into in this space is this excessive focus on precision when we're dealing with plenty of uncertainty in terms of what is the proper price, what's the proper valuation. And it just begs the question, should we even be designing any type of system that is so sensitive if estimates are off by a few percentage points? So for example, say, should we not be designing something where even if we're off by 10, 20%, 25, even 30%, that it still retains a certain degree of robustness against that? So, and of course, and the other benefit of that, of course, would be being able to cut down on a lot of the costs of compliance, enforcement, and those things, especially around the smallholders, that if we try minimizing not just how much the smallholders would have to do, but also minimize the overhead required, so that even places with very limited organizational capacity are able to manage it. For example, even the LMICs, those that don't actually have that much capacity within the public sector to oversee these things, again, just drawing on lessons from India and a number of other places where they've tried copy and pasting a lot of what was done elsewhere, and what ended up happening was it just clogged up the public sector in these countries even further. So it's like having to avoid that type of trap, such that you're trying to get to some idea or you're trying to make improvements, yet it ends up being prohibitive to the vast majority of parties involved.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I'll answer that first. Yeah, I'd go back to, isn't that, that's statement about there's more than 1 billion interactions going on in a teaspoon of soil that, we'll never figure out. So, we can't quite identify what's going on in a teaspoon of soil. So why do we think we identify what's going on in a landscape? with any precision. So I agree. So, and on our farm, well, here's an example of metric data that people embrace. So in the United States, the USDA comes out with like a June crop report, and it states how many bushels per acre that yield is going to be. Well, there is no kernels on the corn at that time. So, there's no measurement. It's just a metric of valuation, and the market looks at that to the 10th of the bushel. 161.1 bushels per acre will change the market versus 157.4. Okay. What's the accuracy there? It's in that range you mentioned. It's probably plus or minus 12 or 15 on each side. So yes, we have a tendency to zoom in on precision and call it precision. But to your point, I think we just need to acknowledge the range of precision that is acceptable and the price of that. We need to be directionally correct. Small holders need to be, what can we do best to assist small holders? Any kind of entity. Well, they would do a search on our map of anything less than, let's say, 8 hectares or whatever it is. And they want to purchase ecosystem services from those smallholders, and they want to purchase perhaps carbon sequestration, and they want to use this metric that has a confidence of 70%. And so you drive the direction. We're trying to solve issues, and then there's market issues as well, and both have a play. But I think as long as we're transparent in the metric and the confidence level and the price, then we can move in a direction, and people can decide what that is worth. It's these two parties on each side deciding what the value is to meet their needs. Now, to the other question was on the data requirements or the data access. So, and on all those different layers. So, and there's various levels of sophistication. I hire an agronomist. I can go to their website and I can draw polygons around my field. I input what I do on that land, and they have the GIS data in there. And by applying an algorithm, they can tell me what my expected yield is or my expected carbon sequestration. So those pieces exist for, somewhat of my capacity, which is not a large mainstream farm operation. No. So if you go to less resources, it's one of those things where you can see what data. Here's kind of the interesting part. For me to produce a certain amount of carbon sequestration, it is the exact same thing I'm doing to produce the crop, right? Everything happens simultaneously. The data that I have to produce the crop is the same data I'll use to calculate my carbon. And so that's kind of the sense we have to look at. These are all integrated. And this is the data I need to be productive and financially better off, is the same data I'm going to use to calculate where I'm at with my other ecosystem services. There isn't two management schemes on one piece of land. It's the same management scheme on the same land, and the outputs of each individual one flux simultaneously. So to your question is, we need to find the data that's valuable to that producer to produce the crop or whatever they're producing, and then identify which of those pieces we're missing to calculate the other ecosystem services. And sometimes they're all there, sometimes they're missing, sometimes the confidence level goes down because something's missing, but there you go with the precision.
Thank you very much, Tim. Folks, we're at the end of our time already. Went fast. We've got a recording. We'll be putting it on the Global Regen Collab Slack. If you're not part of the GRC, just get in touch with me and we'll help you join. And you'll have Tim's contact there, and we can keep a conversation going there as well. So Tim, is there anything you want to add just before we close?
Sure. This has been a long journey, of course. Things have accelerated this last summer. We are in the final stages, hopefully, of getting a minimum viable platform built here. I kind of get confirmation on Monday if that's going forward. Surprisingly, to get something going is a little less costly than I thought as I was looking over the years. So yeah, but hopefully we have good news, and hopefully then we can invite people to participate in some manner and play with this grid and see if it works. And please reach out to me with any questions.
Thanks everyone for joining the circle. We'll see you again next Thursday at 18 CET or Wednesday at 9:30 CET if you're available, whenever. So until next time, thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Andrew.